Well, up to this point, everything we've done has been two-handed. That was our marksmanship, our reloads, our malfunctions. We've done it with two hands. But what happens if one of your hands is not able to manipulate the firearm? Now what do we do? Well, there's three basic areas that you want to work on. You want to work on your marksmanship with one hand, your reloads with one hand, and your malfunctions with one hand. Because, hey, the worst case scenario is something goes wrong with one of those hands. Let's say we're in a self-defense situation. Maybe we get shot in the hand, or maybe even something as simple as we fall and somehow break our hand or something, and we're unable to use it. How do we get through this situation? Well, we're going to start by talking about marksmanship. So with marksmanship, we've talked all this time about how to do things with both hands on the firearm, right? So we've had a two-handed grip. Well, now if we're going to change up to a one-handed grip, there's a couple different things you can do, and it's important to know that none of these do you have to do. They're just things you can do. They're little tips and tricks. So one thing that a lot of people like to do is they like to take their firearm, and when they're shooting one-handed, they like to cant it just a little bit. Now, when we say cant it a little bit, we're not talking about sideways gangster style. We're talking about just a little bit of a cant. What this does is when the recoil comes, it allows the bulk of the recoil to come right into the strength of your hand over here. So you're directing that recoil into the strength of your hand by canting it just a hair. Again, if you do it like this isn't helping you. This is creating more issues for you. But just a little bit of a cant. And it's not an exact amount, but just a little. So canting the firearm just a hair is one thing that you can do. Another thing that you can do is you can make sure that you've got that one foot just about a half step back, just like we did with two-handed marksmanship, but you want to make sure that you've got about a half step back with your one foot, your strong foot. Now, when this switches up to your support hand, now what do? Well, now there's other things to think about, right? You can do the same thing. You can get that little bit of a cant there just to, again, allow you to have the bulk of the recoil coming into the strength of your hand. So just a little bit of a cant. Now there's a couple of things you can do here. You can either stand with that strong foot back as you had been and continue to shoot like that, or some people like to switch it up. They like to put their support foot back if their support hand is shooting. Now, as we said in the beginning, none of these is a way that you have to do it. These are just tips and techniques that some people find effective in shooting one-handed. Regardless of the technique that you choose, make sure that you practice one-handed shooting at the range. Don't rely on two-handed shooting all the time. Make sure that you're comfortable enough to switch up if you needed to. Now, what about reloads with one hand? Well, obviously this is a two-handed manipulation, right? So how do we accomplish it with one? Well, we're going to talk first about our strong hand. And we're going to talk about it like we have a holster on us. So if we have a holster and we were out shooting and our support hand got disabled somehow, a way you can simulate this is by turning around and grabbing the back of your pants or your belt or your shirt or something, just keep it out of the way. So if you got disabled with your support hand, you only had your strong hand, you're shooting and you go empty, how can you reload? Well, one simple thing you can do is, first off, go ahead and get that mag, drop down to the ground, right? And now, if you've got your holster, simply put it in your holster, use your strong hand to grab your magazine, and put it into place with a tap tug, back on target. But now, what if you don't have a holster? How are you going to reload if you don't have a holster? Well, you're going to do the same thing as we just did with a holster. You're going to go ahead and lose that magazine. But now what you got to do is find a different place to keep it. So what you want to do is you want to take maybe right between your knees can be a good spot. You want to turn that firearm around and place it in there so that you can now get your magazine, tap, tug, and come back out. Now, regardless of the technique you choose, you want to make sure that this finger is staying off the trigger when you're doing these techniques. Also, most ranges aren't going to allow you to practice these types of techniques at the range for safety reasons. So this is a good thing that you can practice with your dry fire. You can practice your reloads with one hand during dry fire. Now let's say we find ourselves in the unenviable position of having our strong hand disabled for some reason. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to disable that strong hand by grabbing on the back of that belt there, keeping it out of play. And we're going to pretend in this scenario that we actually have our holster as we do here. So you're out shooting, bang, 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 you need to speed reload. The first thing you need to figure out is how do you access that magazine release button? Because you're not used to shooting left-handed most likely. So again, this is a good reason why you should be practicing things single-handed both ways, both support and strong-handed. So to access that magazine release button as a lefty, as we talked about earlier in our training, you would use the trigger finger usually. Typically use your trigger finger to access that. So you'd want to go ahead and release that magazine. Again, you're keeping your eyes down range while you're doing it. You're not watching the firearm, you're watching what's going on down range. You've released that magazine. Now, since you have a holster, take advantage of it. But you'll notice if I try to put it in like this gets a little awkward, right? It's a cross reach across the body. So what you're going to do is this. Turn the firearm around, put it in the holster backwards. And you'll notice it'll stay in there fine. This works with most holsters. Most holsters will accept the firearm backwards. It doesn't fit right, but it'll fit to get the job done. So now you're going to take your fresh mag, put it in there, tap, tug, and back out onto target. Now let's say we don't have our holster. We don't have our holster and we don't have our strong hand. We're in bad shape, right? Well, again, what we can do is just like we did with our strong hand. We're out shooting, bang, 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 bring the gun in. We're going to release that magazine, and now we can turn, put it between our knees, and then grab our magazine, tap, tug, back out on target. Now let's talk about what we do for malfunctions with one hand. This is clearly two-handed manipulations we need. So we have to get creative here. And now I'm going to show you a couple little techniques. None of these are the be-all, end-all. What it takes is using what works for you. So again, this is a great thing to practice in dry fire to find out what works for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off, we're going to pretend that we're shooting with our strong hand only. We're getting our support hand disabled on the back there. We can't use it. So we're out shooting strong hand only, bang, 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 and I get a click. Oh boy, this is a bad day, right? Well, what is our immediate reaction? We get our finger off the trigger, we come in and do what? Tap and tug, rack and roll, assess. Okay, we're going to have to modify it a little bit. You can still do the tap and tug. The rack and roll is going to be a little tougher. You're only probably going to be able to accomplish a rack. Now, if you can get a rack and roll in, that's great. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to first off pretend we've got that holster. So what we're going to do, obviously, is we're going to go ahead and get that firearm into the holster. We're going to tap, tug, make sure it's firmly in place there. Now that we've got the tap tug done, we now need to get the rack done. So how we can do that is, on most firearms, you can use your sights. Use your sights. And what you'll want to do is you want to take it and you want to hook it, either the front sight or the rear sight, whichever works better for you, depending on your firearm. You want to hook it onto your holster and rack it, like so. Now, an alternative option, it's not as easy, but it is one that works, is to take right up on the front of the slide, in between where the barrel and the slide is, you can hook that onto the frame as well, or excuse me, onto the holster as well, and rack it that way also. Now, additional options would include raising your foot up and using maybe your heel, pressing those sights up against the heel to get it done. If you've got a knife on you, you can use the knife in your pocket. If your belt's sturdy, you can use the belt. Whatever it takes, that's how you're going to do the racking of the slide. You're then going to come back out on target. Now let's say it got really bad for us. We've got to do all these left-handed. Well, nothing's really changed here. We're going to disable that strong hand here, and we're going to use our support hand to do all of this. So again, we need to shoot, we get that click. What do? Finger off the trigger. We come in, we need to figure out how we're going to tap tug and how we're going to rack roll. Now, if we don't have a holster, we can do a couple of different things for our tap tug. We could tuck it in between our knees like we did earlier and tap and tug on the magazine, make sure it's in place. You could bring your foot up and give it a tap on the heel and then maybe a tug on your belt, whatever the case may be, make sure it's in place. However you want to accomplish it, you could even tap it on something hard, your phone, whatever it takes, just to make sure that that's in place. Now that you've done your tap tug, obviously we've got to do just what we talked about earlier. We've got to figure out how we're going to rack that slide. So maybe you've got a sturdy belt, so you want to just use your belt and rack the slide like so. Now what about when we get that ever so tough secondary malfunction, that failure to extract? How do we get through this? Well, obviously if we have the holster, we can use it like we talked about, either with a strong hand putting it in this way, with a support hand we could flip it, put it in this way backwards. You can do whatever you need to do to get that thing into a position where you can lock the slide open. But we're going to pretend that we're going strong hand and we don't have a way to get that slide locked open right now without getting it onto something. We don't have that holster. So one thing we can do is, if we don't have the holster to push it on, we can again use that area between the barrel and the slide, or we can use our sights to hook onto something, maybe our belt, and we're going to just push up on our little slide stop button, finger off the trigger. As we do this, we're just going to push onto it nice and tight here and get that into place. Now we've got that into place, we can now do whatever we need to do, putting it between our knees or whatever. We press that magazine release button and rip that out of there. Now, obviously, we're going to need to find a place to store this because we're not going to be able to do this with one hand with a magazine in it. So we've now got the firearm back out. Now what we want to do is we want to work on racking that slide. And again, if you had the holster, you could work it on the holster. Otherwise, you can use whatever you've got available here. 1, 2, 3. Now, bear in mind, it's going to be almost impossible to get that upwards direction that we wanted to work it. So you're going to have to do your best to work it, even though it's facing downward. Maybe rack it a few times, kind of shake it, whatever it takes to jar loose whatever is in that chamber. But again, we're going to rack it on different parts of our clothing, body, whatever it takes to make this work. Once we've done that, we get it back in the position we need it to be. Again, if you had a holster, you'd use that. If not, you can use between your legs. Get that magazine, tap tug back in place, and rack one into the chamber. Assess to make sure that it's a good time to fire another round, and to assess to make sure that the malfunction is cleared. So as we mentioned, dry fire is a great time to practice these techniques for one-handed manipulations. Whatever your training routine is, make sure that you incorporate one-handed manipulations into the following 3 training areas: marksmanship, reloads, and malfunctions.